some challenges to a catastrophic view. You mentioned three things as geological challenges. Places where sedimentation apparently ceased, the seafloor became hardened and boring creatures like clams, worms, or shrimps colonized the hardened surface. Two, some geological formations contain repeating pairs of thin layers called varves, which are said to represent a single year of deposition in an ancient lake. The total number of such layers suggests that some geologic formations must have taken millions of years to be laid down. Number three, in other sedimentary layers, we find structures that resemble reefs. Modern reefs grow slowly by the activity of living creatures such as corals. If the buried reefs grew at similar rates in the places where we now find them, it would suggest that the sedimentary layers containing them took a long time to form.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that not all of the evidence points uniformly in one direction, and we have to acknowledge that there are challenges to the catastrophic interpretation of the geological record, and we shouldn't ignore them. The three that I mentioned there, the first one is a phenomenon known as hard grounds, where what you have in effect is what seems to be a preserved rocky seafloor.
Okay.
Where the seafloor has been lithified, it's been hardened into rock, and then you've got these encrusting and burrowing organisms that have colonized it. I guess the important question there is exactly how long does this take to produce? How long does it take for a seafloor to harden and for it to be colonized by these kinds of organisms? It probably isn't a long time. So we're talking about relatively short periods of time by comparison to the age of the Earth. But I guess the real challenge is that many of these hard grounds are found in sedimentary rocks that as young age creationists we think were deposited during the flood. And of course then we have much greater time constraints because the flood is about a year. And I think creationists need to look at those in more depth. I don't think a huge amount of work has been done to look at hard grounds. A few papers have been published presenting some possible alternative interpretations of hard grounds, but I think a lot more work needs to be done in that area. The same really applies to the other examples I gave. Another example is this thing called varved sediment, where you have alternating thin layers. They're often sort of paper thin layers, interpreted as the product of annual deposition in, for example, ancient lakes. And in some of these deposits you have very large numbers of varves, and if they are truly annual layers, then you could be talking about timescales of hundreds of thousands or even millions of years for deposition of these varved sequences.
And so you apparently don't think that they are annual deposition layers.
Right, I think in a creationist model they have to be something other than annual. They have to be deposited more quickly than this, and I think there are some evidences that sort of point in that direction. I mentioned, in my book, there are examples where varved sediments have built up multiple layers in a single year. Okay. And so, again, that's something that I think needs a lot more research. And then the third example is the one that you mentioned, which is about coral reefs. So I'm not talking here about modern reefs, although there might be time challenges with modern reefs too, because they have to have grown in the time since the end of the flood in the creationist model. But I'm particularly thinking here of buried reefs. So these are fossil reefs in effect, what appear to be coral reef or other types of reefs that are in sedimentary rock units. And I think, again, we need to look at these on a case-by-case basis. In some cases, they may not be true reefs at all. Sometimes when you look at these structures, they don't have the true sort of framework, growth framework that you expect of a genuine reef.
Okay.
It appears to be more composed of fragments of fossils, fragments of coral or other organisms that are floating in a matrix of fine lime mud.
Okay.
So it doesn't seem to have the growth framework of a reef. In other cases, it could be that what's being interpreted as a reef is simply a big transported block of reef limestone that perhaps was growing before the flood and was then broken up, transported and redeposited during the flood. Again, in some cases there seems to be evidence that points in this direction. There are reefs in the Silurian rocks in Sweden, for example, where some of the blocks of coral that have been interpreted as reefs actually appear to be upside down. So they're clearly not in the orientation that they originally grew in. They've been transported and overturned. So again, we need to look very carefully at examples of claimed reefs in the geological record before we sort of jump to too hasty conclusions.
Okay. Do you know of anyone working on the on one of those issues that hasn't received too much attention? Do you know any current creationist scientist who's working on one of those?
John Whitmore, who is a creationist geologist at Cedarville University in Ohio, he wrote a very good chapter on reef limestones.
Okay.
In a book which it's called Rock Solid Answers. I was just looking up at my bookshelf there to try and remind myself of the title. It's Rock Solid Answers, and he did a very good review of claims of ancient reefs and possible alternative explanations.
Great.
So that's one. That's one place that people can go and find out a bit more about that if they're interested.
Thank you for listening. Credible Faith is a global missions-minded apologetics ministry with content available in 7 different languages across 7 websites: German, Russian, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. If you would like to support the global apologetics work of Credible Faith, go to crediblefaith.org and click on the donate icon. If you would like me to give an apologetics workshop or participate in a debate at your university, or if you would like me to give a Great Commission missions conference or apologetics conference at your church, get in touch with me through the Contact Us section of the Credible Faith website. You can also submit a request through the website to get Credible Faith's monthly email. If you are a native speaker of Russian, German, Italian, French, Spanish, or Portuguese, and if you notice that an essay from the English website is not available on the Credible Faith website for your language, feel free to get in touch with me about translating the essay, and I would read through your translated material for quality control and the desire to see content from the essay made available in your language. Thank you for listening, and have a great night.